summer today, isn't it? Does it feel like summer? All right. Zechariah. That's the only way I know how to pronounce it. We've joked about some of the other minor prophets, but that's the only way I know how to pronounce this one. What about you guys? Is that it? Zechariah? Okay.
Is it the longest one?
It is the longest one. In fact, your outline, let's see here. Your outline says the book of Zechariah is the 11th of the 12 minor prophets. That's not the 11th in our study. Sorry about last week. But anyway, that's the way, this is the order we're going to do it in. So anyway, Zechariah is a pretty lengthy book as you think about the minor prophets. And the chapters aren't that long. They're pretty short chapters. So the whole book isn't extremely long, but we have a larger chapter count than the other minor prophets we've looked at this point. So you got your introduction. We're going to go through this and look at some of these. Point 1 we read, or B, or A, excuse me, now we go to B. Some have said Zechariah is the most difficult among any of the Old Testament books to understand. Okay? That's because of the figurative nature of the book. And so that makes it more difficult. And so it's going to remind us of books like Ezekiel and Revelation, some of the things that are said and how they're said in those books. And so we'll probably look at that, some more of that, more in detail this week, or not this week, next week. So the author, just like many of the other books that we've looked at, we look at verse 1. It says, in the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, the prophet, saying. And so this is a prophecy. So later on in your notes, if you jump down to 5, it's going to say the author of the book attributed his message to God at a rate of about 6 times per chapter. And these are short chapters. So we see in verse 1, right off the bat, then we see the word of the Lord came to who? Zechariah. So message from God. And we see that. And so we back up to 2. It says the name of Zechariah was a very common name and means the Lord remembers or God remembers. Okay? So, this is fitting because of the date of the book, and I know we're not to that point either, but the date of the book, as with a couple of the last minor prophets we looked at, was after the captivity. Who did God remember? Because as we've talked about, a lot of these names have to do with what was happening, right? We're talking about the time period. This is time period when Ezra, Nehemiah were influential. Jerusalem the walls were being rebuilt. The temple was being put back together. It was now becoming open for worship under these individuals. What did God say? There would always be a remnant, okay, to come back. So God remembers. I think all of us are familiar with, what Peter wrote when he said that the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness. And before that, he talks about, not before, in that context, he talks about one day is the same as 1,000 years with God, right? Over time, we have a tendency to forget things, don't we? Things wear down. We say, oh, yeah, I remember back when, like I mentioned, Kathy one time shared a note with me in her Bible. And I said, that is good. I said, I need to write that down. Remember that? She said, I think I got it from you. Anyway, time does that to us, doesn't it? But here we have Zechariah's name, the Lord remembers. And God remembered his promises to his people that they would be able to come back to the land, rebuild. And that was needed for the Messiah. Okay, so we see a fulfillment of prophecy happening here. There are no less than 29 different Zechariahs mentioned in the Bible. So it's hard to trace them. And you go back and you look at verse 1:1. How many generations are mentioned here? Zechariah was the son of his dad, and his dad was the son of his grandfather. I know that's paraphrased. But why is that significant? Yeah, to understand which Zechariah are we talking about, okay? And to me, as I study that, this makes sense that this adds to the canonicity of the Bible, the accuracy of the Bible, because Zechariah was moved by God to write these things, right? So, not all the prophets mentioned who their father or grandfather was, but Zechariah did. Why? That was inspired. Because God knew what was in the rest of the Bible, right? Okay? So you think about that, and I think that's a significant thing for us to realize.
Spelled this way in the Bible? Because like in today's, like Debbie's grandson and a lot of people that are Zach is with an A, right? It'd be Zechariah?
But he's not. His name's not Zechariah, is it? Is Zach?
Zachary.
Zachary.
There are other people though too, like in English, that Zechariah, that spells it A, or is that just Zachary?
I don't know.
I
I'm
didn't know
not the
if it's
person to
spelled-
ask Kathy is on spellings.
didn't
I don't know.
If it's spelled differently in the Bible or just always put the Z-E-C-H.
I would say we'd have to look into that. But, we realize with the King James Version, when it was translated, there wasn't standardized spelling. Then when we get to the New King James, they updated some of the names. So I think that maybe there might be just some discrepancy. I don't know, based on the Old New Testament in the King James. That's something to look into. That's your assignment for next week. So, all right. Zechariah was a prophet and a priest. And one thing that we need to realize when we talk about fulfillment of prophecies in general, the thing is every detail of the prophecy has to line up, right? And so as we think about that, and I just want to mention this because this is one of the people that's mentioned as having a double purpose role. And what I mean by that is you've got three things that Christ was going to be. He's going to be a prophet, a priest, and who knows the last one? King. Prophet, priest, and king. David, what was he? We know he's a king and he was a prophet, right? He wrote part of the Psalms, right? He was a prophet. Okay, so he's a prophet, a king. What was he not? He wasn't a priest, right? We have this individual. He's a prophet and a what? Priest, but he's never a king. So again, the accuracy of the prophecies of the Old Testament in regarding the coming of the Christ, you had a lot of individuals that could have been close to the Christ, but they weren't the Christ. Okay, so that's something I just wanted to point out, notable. Go to Nehemiah 12 and verse 4. We talk about contemporaries. If somebody's there, they're welcome to read it, but I'm trying to get my big fingers on this little book here. All right, Nehemiah 12 and verse 4. Iddo is mentioned in the beginning of verse 4. If we want to try to pronounce these, we go back to verse 12. These are the priests and Levites who came up with Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, Serah, Jeremiah, and Ezra. So we're talking about contemporaries here, right? So he's mentioned here. Go to Ezra 5 and verse 1. Ezra 5 and verse 1. Then the prophet Haggai and Zechariah the son of Iddo, prophets, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Okay, we have these men mentioned, traceable. 6:14, Ezra 6:14. I know why nobody's reading. We've got names in the verses. We'll skip that tonight. So the elders of the Jews built And they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo, and they built and finished it according to the commandment of God of Israel and according to the commandment of Cyrus king Darius and Artaxerxes or Xerxes king of Persia. And so when you look at this, does anybody have a chapter break, or not chapter break, a break above verse 13? What's your heading say there? Temple finished. Okay. And so he was there. He was a part of this. He was influential in this. And so the restoration of the Jews, Zechariah, the Lord remembers, God remembers. He was the son of Barakai and the grandson of Iddu. I keep saying that differently, don't I? Forgive me. The author of the book attributed his message to God at a rate of 6 times per chapter. We mentioned that. That's significant. When we think about when he was writing, right? They come back from Babylonian captivity. And what is Zechariah constantly telling these individuals? This message is from God. This message is from God. Where's this message from, Zechariah? He says it's from God. And this was important for them to establish the authorship of Zechariah of where his message was. The day of the book, the first 8 chapters are dated between 520 and 518. Of course, remember the time's still going backwards. So there's a dispute among scholars. What we see is there's a break between when the first part of the book was written, the second part. And so when they were exactly written, we don't know. You know, it doesn't matter when a book of the Bible was written. We just need to know that it is a book of the Bible, right? And so whether, we spend a lot of time researching this and we read different things, the key is we know that the canonicity of the book is there and it's accepted part of the Bible. And so it's been suggested that some of the chapters 7 through 14 were delivered in December of 518, so this would be near the end, but we do have 2 parts of the book. The historical setting of the book, we've discussed this a little bit already by way of introduction, but in 520 BC, Zechariah joined Haggai in urging the Jews to complete the task of what? Maybe I should have put renovating the temple, right? This is a rebuild, but renovate. They had to complete the project that they started. We talked about that when we studied that book. That's the significance behind that. The result of the 2 prophets' efforts was the completion of the temple, and it's estimated to be 516 BC. And we go back, I think we read verse 14, didn't we? Yeah, go back to Ezra 6 and verse 15. We'll read this. Now the temple was finished in the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of Darius, or King Darius. I'm having trouble reading it. I'm sorry. I didn't clean my glasses before I came. So, good question. Does anybody know how many years did it take to rebuild the temple? Did we talk about that? I don't know if we talked about this in this. Me too. We'll look that up. I'm going to write that as a question because now I want to think about that later. Let's see. How many years? I think, I don't have all my outlines with me. I think if we would have taken the books of when they came back, so that had been Ezra, I think we could actually find the answer pretty quick. When they came back and then when it was completed, it gave the timestamp here. In March. Does it say when it started, Barb? Does that have a key of information there?
6 years, 521 to 515.
521.
Me too. How long did it take to build it?
5 years.
6, 5 or 6?
Depends when they started. Okay. Thank you, Andy.
I'm not sure that was right.
He's going to study more on that. All right, the outline of the book. First 8 chapters, encouragement for the people regarding the temple. Chapters 9 through 14, encouragement for the people regarding the coming of Christ. And so we see messianic prophecies there. The book contains 8 visions, 4 messages, and 2 burdens. And so as we think about the burdens, let's go ahead and talk about that because I figured somebody's going to ask a question about that. Go chapter 9. Go to chapter 9. We'll look at verse 1. It says, the burden of the word of the Lord against the land of Hadrach and Damascus, its resting place for the eyes of men, and for all the tribes of Israel are on the Lord. So, verse 1 begins with what? The prophecy of a what? A burden or a difficulty. We jump ahead and we go to chapter 12. One burden, second burden, chapter 12. So the burden of the word of the Lord against Israel, thus says the Lord, who stretches out the heavens, lays the foundation of the earth, and forms the spirit of man within him. Okay, so we see these mentioned. And we'll probably look at those, probably not this week, but we'll look a little bit more at these in detail next week as we come together and we study. What are some of the lessons from the book? And of course, as we put this, I think about this. We do these outlines, hand them out. These aren't the only lessons in the book, of course. We know that. But chapter 1, verses 18 through 21. Chapter 1, 18.
And I raised my eyes and looked, and there were 4 horns. And I said to the angel who talked with me, what are these? So he answered me, these are the horns that have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. Then the Lord showed me 4 craftsmen, and I said, what are these coming to do? So he said, these are the horns that scattered Judah, so that no one could lift up his head, but the craftsmen are coming to terrify them, to cast out the horns of the nations that lifted up their horn against the land of Judah to scatter.
Okay, so you guys got your outline. You know what this means, but what are the 4 horns? The nations, okay. And so, as were there horns talked about in Revelation? Isn't Eric talked about some horns? I think he's to that point. And we've been gone a lot of Sundays. But anyway, so you think about that, the figurative language that we see here. 4 horns represent Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. What were these countries at this time in history? World powers, weren't they? They're war powers, or world powers, and they wanted to fight against who? Against God's nation, God's people. We see in chapter 14, go from the front of the book to the back of the book, we have that there will be a restoration that's going to take place. Zechariah 14:1. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming. We stop there and we talk about this a little bit because when we think about what was in Israel's mind, here they've been released from captivity. They're allowed to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild their holy city. As part of that, as we read a verse earlier, talked about Darius, the commandment of King Darius, that he instructed the Jews to go back and complete this mission. So they went back, they've completed the temple, right? What, in the Jewish mindset, what would be the next greatest restoration for that people, or the greatest step forward? When they were led away to captivity, what did they lose? Their temple. Okay, that's been rebuilt, right? They lost access to the temple. They lost their capital city, Jerusalem. Who also lived in Jerusalem? Their king. Right? What did they not get back? Even though they got back and they were able to rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, what did they not have back yet? The king. Okay. Now keep your finger here because we're looking at this. But go to Acts 1. And here we have Jesus' disciples with him. This is right before the ascension. Okay. Now, as you think about this, when Christ was put on trial, what was one of the things he was accused of proclaiming to be? The king of Israel. Right? What was Israel looking for? Okay. How do we know that? Well, we're going to read this. Verse 6, therefore, when they had come together, they asked him, saying, Lord, will you at this time restore what? The kingdom to Israel. What had the disciples and the apostles missed out on as far as overlooked up to this point? That the kingdom that Daniel prophesied about in Daniel chapter 2 was not going to be a what? Physical kingdom, right? And so as we think about that, we come back and look at Zechariah 14. It said, behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst, and I will gather all nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the house is rifled, and women ravished. Half of your people shall go into captivity, but the remnant of your people shall be cut off from before the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against these nations as he fights in the day of battle. And it keeps on going. But again, even though there's a restoration that had taken place, and it was the current restoration that God had planned, what were they still looking for? The restoration of a king to become their own nation. Okay? We understand that Christ was going to fulfill the prophecy, but not in the ways that the Jews anticipated, right? And so we see that. So there was a restoration, and there's going to continue to be, just not quite like they had anticipated. Go back to Zechariah 10, verse 6. I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph. I will bring them back because I have mercy on them. They shall be as though I had not cast them aside, for I am the Lord their God, and I will hear them. What's significant about Judah? Seed line of Christ. Okay. Again, God remembers. We look at the name Zechariah. Zechariah 6 in verse 12. Zechariah 6:12. 6:12. Then speak to him, saying, thus says the Lord of hosts, saying, behold, the man whose name is the branch, from this place he shall branch out, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. Okay, this is a prophecy, and it's talking about Christ coming. Go to Isaiah 11:1. Christ was. Oh, sorry.
There shall come
Okay,
forth
go ahead.
a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his root.
You want to do 2 while you're
The
there.
Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might, and the spirit of knowledge and of the Lord, and of the fear of the Lord.
Okay. So, does that sound like the Christ? I'm going to give you a page stuck together. Go to Isaiah 9:6 while you're there. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. What would that make Christ? King. His name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform it. And I mention these verses because, as we just read from Acts, Was it wrong? Was it wrong for the Jews to be looking for the king of their kingdom? No. No, because of prophecy, right? But there was a misunderstanding. It was wrong to reject Christ. That was the problem. But it wasn't wrong for them to look for someone who was going to be the governor, the king, the Lord over his kingdom, right? And so as we think about this, Israel brought out of Egypt in the wilderness, period of the judges, finally got kings, right? And once they finally got kings, after a few good kings, had a long line of mediocre kings, some good ones along the way, right? And then they lost their kingdom because God said, and this is all paraphrased, right? Because we're telling a long story real quick. God says, if you don't straighten up, you're going to lose your kingdom. But there'll be a restoration, there'll be a remnant. Now what we just read, and we could go to Daniel chapter 2 and look at this also. The next kingdom, once it was restored, when was it going to fall? Never. What were they looking for? They said, we want a kingdom that will never fall. The Jews have seen nations come and go. The four horns that we mentioned, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia. We see nations come, nations go. And God says one day the Jews, in their minds, it's the Jews, are going to have a nation that will last forever. Right? Well, it came in form of the church. They were looking for it, but many people missed that. All right, Zechariah 1 through 6. Any questions or comments about that? You ever studied something and been embarrassed that you misunderstood it? And then when you finally understand it, you say, how could I believe it that way? You ever thought that some of the Jews were that way? I think so, you know. Anyway, but they were still searching. Our eyes have to be open. We have to be searching for the truth. Zechariah 1 through 6, we read verse 1 already. We'll restart verse 2 because we're already out of time. It says, the Lord has been very angry with your fathers. Therefore say to them, thus says the Lord of hosts, return to me, says the Lord of hosts, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. Do not be like your fathers, to whom the former prophets preached, saying, thus says the Lord of hosts, turn now from your evil ways and from your evil deeds. But they did not hear nor heed me, says the Lord. Your fathers, where are they? The prophets, do they live forever? Yet surely my words and my statutes, which I command my servants and prophets, did they not overtake your fathers? So they returned and said, just as the Lord of hosts determined to do to us according to your ways and according to our deeds, so he has dealt with us. Think about this. God always blesses us until we mess up. Right? You think about that? Adam and Eve in the garden. What did Adam and Eve do to deserve what they had?
Disobey.
No, not that. Not yet.
Oh,
not yet.
oh.
Not yet. What did they do to deserve to be in the garden?
Remain.
They didn't do anything to deserve it, right? Did they do anything to have that blessing taken away? God always blesses first, right? He takes it away when we mess up. You think about that. All right, we'll look at some of the text of Zechariah next week. Any questions or comments?